Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Data Applications and Transportation Planning webinar, the final trilogy of ITRE's Economic and Policy Assessment Group's Data Applications webinar series. I'm Steve Burt, and I'll be moderating our session today in collaboration with Eugene Murray. And we have an excellent panel of speakers that will be presenting here today. First up, we have Dr. Alex Diemers, and she'll be presenting on the data sources and applications that are used to evaluate train safety, passenger and freight rail operations, and the economic implications of freight movement. Up next, we will have Amanda Connor, and she will be speaking on the various data sets that have been used to assess economic activity generated by aviation and aerospace in North Carolina. And closing out our ticket today, we will have Thomas Dudley. He'll be demonstrating how to use geospatial and economic data to identify bridges that are critical to North Carolina agriculture and commerce. And before we get started today, I'd like to go over some of the ways in which you can interact with our speakers. You'll notice that we have a Q&A or question and answer tab at the bottom of the screen. You can enter any questions that you have for a speaker here. And either myself or Eugene Murray, who's facilitating this webinar, will make sure that your questions are read. And after each panelist presents, we'll leave time for them to address any questions that you may have for them. You may also choose to ask one of the speakers a question verbally. And if so, please raise your virtual hand and Eugene and I will unmute you. You'll notice there is a hand button at the bottom of the taskbar of your screen. And if you click on that button, it will raise your hand, and then we can know that you have a verbal question that you want to relay to one of the panelists. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get started. The impetus for today's webinar was to gain access to expert insights, techniques, and applications for using data as it relates to transportation planning. And I'm excited to see what our speakers have in store for us. I'd like to take the opportunity now to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Alex Diemers. As an embedded contractor in North Carolina's Department of Transportation's Rail Division, Dr. Demers works in the rail planning group, coordinating and performing rail project STI scoring for STIP funding, using visual analytics for examining the Class I Railroad Waybill sample, conducting railroad operation simulations, analyzing passenger services in North Carolina, which include optimizing scheduling on shared use corridors, revamping one of the grant programs for short lines, as well as participating in strategic initiative pursuits. And before working with the Rail Division, Dr. Demers was the traffic forecasting and simulation team lead in AECOM's Raleigh office with a secondary role in maritime and rail freight planning. Her interest in freight rail systems began as a University of Texas summer intern, collecting data on maquiladoras, and years later developed while a doctoral student. Then research assistant professor at North Carolina State University with key studies including the NC Statewide Logistics Plan and the 7 Portals study for logistics villages. Alex, I'm going to take the opportunity now to hand it over to you. And there's a green share button at the bottom of the screen. Let me know if you have any difficulties sharing your screen.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Steve. Let me bring up the presentation. All right. And it helped to be all the way at the beginning, doesn't it? So let's get it to the beginning. All right. Well, hi there, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to tell you a little bit about railroading and to help you find resources and data, be able to analyze them and work with them in the world of planning and engineering. I want to start, of course, with the safety minute. Our big thing in wherever I've worked is safety. We want to keep motoring public and public in general safe. Crashes happen very often at highway, railroad, grade crossing. There have been promotions since the early 1900s with signage and other information to try and keep you safe. So follow that information and stay safe, especially at railroad crossings. All right, now we're moving into the sandbox of railroad engineering and railroad planning. And it's a different world from highways. If you're used to that, it's a different world from aviation and maritime. So there's lingo to worry about. There's different people playing the game that you might need to interact with in the planning realm. And there are questions that we need to answer. And some of them are similar to what's going on in the traffic world or the aviation world, for example. Some of the questions might be slightly different. So I want to give you a little information on how to do that. So quick thing on terminology, you can refer back to a lot of these slides. I'm going to go through these a bit quick, but there's things like in the highway world, you've got driveways. Well, in the railroad world, that'd be called a spur. So you'd come off of the main network to reach one particular user or entity. And then there's things like super elevation in the highway world where you're trying to drive around a curve. So you need to tilt up the roadway to make it safer to be able to drive well. If you think of a racetrack, in the railroad world, you can use things with vehicle as well as the trackage, and that's more called cant deficiency. There's different elements to work at and look at. Now we want to move across the network, and the big things we're moving passengers and we're moving freight. And when we're moving passengers, we'll often talk about different train types. Am I trying to get from California to New Orleans, or am I trying to get from Long Island to Midtown New York City, Midtown Manhattan? Well, that's going to have some different issues involved. Everything from the length of the corridor is going to be distinctly different. So the service frequency and how the stations are spaced is going to be different. And we need to consider that, because especially something like station spacing then goes into market capture. So you start to see that element of the economy creeping in. Now, in the world of freight, it's quite obvious. What are we doing? We're trying to move goods across the network so that people can go buy stuff or people can make things. And it's done over different classes of the railroad. Class ones, you kind of think of guys, these are the major railroads, that there's 7 in the entire United States, but there's all these very small regional short lines. There's, I believe it's around 600 of them. And so they differ in how much revenue they get each year and the network size. When you're getting into what's being hauled, there's different reasons you're hauling something, and there's different ways to do it, whether it's by a carload, so you dump a whole bunch of coal into a hopper and you move it along, or do you stuff a bunch of widgets into a container and ship it across the network? And those then have different service characteristics that need to be paid attention to in the freight world. Now we know who's going to be there in terms of moving across the network, but who are the players in this sandbox that we're dealing with? When we're actually in the sandbox, you're going to find the different companies, freight and passenger companies, that are trying to operate their system. You're also going to have the railroad owners and the operators. The majority of track in the United States is owned privately by the Class I railroad companies, and then some short lines own stuff. The public owns very little, and so that means we've got to negotiate and work very closely with railroad industry to be able to improve a network, add something, change how something is operated on that network. So that then comes into, okay, here are the people I'm playing with in the sandbox. But then, who's hovering outside the sandbox? Well, we've got all of these agencies and groups that are kind of looking over us like parents. Now they might be giving us laws and rules, and they might be collecting data. How are they doing? Which team is winning? So there might be different agencies there cheering on their team or lobbying for them. Let's get them better rights. No, they need better shovels. That is important to know who those players are and to know that they are resources. There's an awful lot of data and information we can gain from working with them. Now, okay, you've got your sandbox, you're ready to go. Wait, there's rules. We've got to know what rules we're allowed to follow. Can I just throw sand at you? Probably wouldn't be nice. All right, how do I make something? Do I need to work with you? Am I competing against you? There's rules of the road, just like in the highway world, where you've got the Department of Motor Vehicles, you have operating rules, and they can vary depending where you are in the network. And then there are agreements that we have. A lot of states and public agencies make agreements with particular railroad companies so that we can run, say, a passenger train across a freight network, and that's key. We have agreements. So a big point of news I wanted to mention, this was cool, but it changes what data we are able to obtain. The Surface Transportation Board on Monday just announced, they ruled rather, that the Class I threshold, how much money it takes to be deemed a Class I railroad, has been raised from $500 million to $900 million. Now, what that means is that we will no longer get data from any railroad that might be earning less than that 900 million. Now, it really won't impact us, especially in our area. So where I am from North Carolina, this was because of, I believe it was a Montana regional line. And they were like, wait, we're right on that 500 million threshold. Do we have to meet it? So this is going to change what data the feds get collected and get in terms of economic data, safety data, and other types of data. So that's key for us when it comes to trying to figure out stuff. Now, there's a whole bunch of little niche programs and data elements that you can pull in. This slide gives you some ideas and things that you can go back to. But different programs and different data elements are going to help you depending on what you're trying to analyze. So if we look at two major types of analysis, I'm going to first show you a quick network analysis, and then I'm going to show you an economic analysis. Let's look at the operations first. I need to get something moving across the network. Maybe I'm trying to optimize performance or move more passengers. But one of the first things we want to do is we want to look at the maps. Well, what's out there? Well, the maps in the world of railroads, you can look at the networks online, and there's some great ones out there, but one of the key things we need to look at are called track charts. And these are showing you what are the curves, how big are they, what are different elements. And a key point that I need to point you to first is that notice that a mile is just not a mile. In the world of track charts, they have mile posting. Now that is the approximate mile, but you can see that between 83 and 84, it's 5,300 feet. In 84 to 85 mile posting, it's only 5,281 feet. Now that's just because there are changes as the network is changed over time. They might have moved a curve slightly, they might have put in a new bridge. That's going to change the actual length of track, but keep the mile posting the same. Important to know things like that, especially when you're doing a down in the weeds analysis, such as for a network operations type analysis or a design analysis. So you'll take this type of track layout information and use it. So once you've got that, it also helps them to just go out there and collect data. You might be collecting data by having sensors in the railroad track itself. You might be collecting data off of the vehicle itself. Or in this type of instance, you'll see that I just happen to have an app and I was collecting information to then look at what's going on in the world in terms of speeds. Are there bottlenecks or other issues I need to pay attention to? Because, oh, I'm hitting a speed of 0. Is that because of a train station? Well, that would be a good reason. Or is it because I hit a slow order? Was I told that there's ice or fog and I had to slow down to go safely through a section of roadway? I can then use this an analysis package such as the general train movement simulator. There are also paid packages. This one is nice because it's free from the federal government, and you can then look at, especially shared use corridors, how are freight trains and passenger trains interacting? How do we need to work together to create a good relationship? Similarly, you can look at string lines. So this is a screenshot of one for passenger operations. And you might be looking at Okay, what are all the rules I need to follow? Can I make this better? Well, I can probably make it better. I might need to work on being able to space out the trains. So now my people can get across the network, different parts of the network well. Well, what does that mean though from the bigger picture? This is what brings us into our economic analysis. The economy and the transportation network are intricately intertwined, and we have to pay attention to that. And so there's different economic resources and tools, and a lot of them you might need to pull together, bring together, create a process, say, to analyze the benefit and the costs of a particular project, to then assess what's going on. So you might be using interesting things like waybill data and peers data. But you can start at the big picture level of looking at Federal Reserve economic data sources. That gives you this great big picture of all the different modes of travel in the freight network and what's going on across the US. But on a smaller level, you might be wanting to try and see what's going on with farmers in your region. Let's take Eastern North Carolina. I know they're sending stuff across the network, but where is it going? Is there a way to help them? Well, one of the ways is to use waybill data to look at some of that and find that out. Now, there's a public version and a private version of waybill data. I'm showing you public version data so that you can access it and see what's available. But if you work for some private sector, some consultants, you can get the private data and get more details, which includes things like revenue estimates. But it says tonnage and it has approximate origins and destinations. You can then pull in things like from the Bureau of Transportation Statistics, you can pull in GIS layers like the North American Rail Nodes layer, the Rail Lines layer, and then see how they all connect. Then you can make assumptions. You've got to do some guesswork here now for what's flowing where and how. And you then come up with some flows. Oh, I've got commodity one. It's doing really well in one year, not so well in another year, and here's where it's going. Okay, well, then what does this mean in terms of what's flowing? At an even larger picture, when I'm looking at the public sector in terms of, I have different flows. Here's what from the waybill data I know is going across the railroad network, what's going across the trucking network, what's going across the maritime network, for example. And you need to pay attention to be able to see, well, who's going to choose in terms of shippers and suppliers, what modes are they going to choose to actually get across the network? And then how do we need to work with them if you're from the public sector or helping the public sector? How are you going to improve the network or improve the economy? And to do that, you look at things like this, a delivered cost model to help you see trade-offs. For example, you might be looking up very weird things in the freight flows or from peers data set, like how many chickens fit in the hull of a ship? This was an actual question I had to answer to create a delivered cost model when we were looking at maritime shipping in North Carolina. It was a weird question, but I needed to know what they threw in because then I needed to know, well, then how did all those chickens, which are actually called broilers in the commodity world, how do they then fit onto a train? How many get into a train car or onto a truck? And then what is the shipper going to choose depending on where they need that to go? So this is the type of work that can be done. And you can look at things like truck turns to make that happen, the railroad network, which I just showed you, and you then research it, use these data sources and tools, a lot of public ones, some private ones, and then an estimation of those costs to be able then to figure out how can I help my economy in my local area? That's it in a nutshell for just two types of analysis. So I'm happy to take any questions and give back control. But as you can see, this is me with all of my climbing gear because I'm trying to figure out the right tool for the next step in my process of getting up this mountain. So thank you very much.
Alex, thank you for your presentation. I have a question for you before maybe any of the audience chimes in with questions. Based on the waybill, peers, track sensor, GIS, and many other data sets that you showcased during your presentation, is there any way to assess how North Carolina compares to other states I don't know, for example, in safety or freight movement, is there a way to make those sort of analyses, or is it hard to piece that together with existing data?
No, you can actually do that. Now, from a safety perspective, that's a difficult one. You can use the Federal Railroad Association agency's data, and be able to pull actual collision reports, different incident reports, and analyze it. And you can do that for across the nation. And so that's a really nice tool. And each state often collects their own safety data. Now, in terms of other parts of safety, that's usually for crossings or major incidents, but then for more minor incidents, you then have to try and contact other people. And so we've done other research projects to figure out what resources there are. Now, if you're looking at it from an economic point of view, you need to be careful. It depends partly on which data you have access to, really. And so it depends on who you're working with. For example, peers data is something that you need to pay for, and you need to have access to through IHS Market. And most of the ports have access to that data. And so if you're working with the port and helping them, you often have access to that data. But if you're trying to compare using waybill data, you don't necessarily have access to waybill data that has nothing to do with whatever entity you're working with. I am working with, for example, being embedded at NCDOT right now, I have access to all waybill sample data that goes in, out, through, and stays within North Carolina. I do not have access to any waybill data that, say, is traveling between California and Washington, except at the public level. And so that's where it's more difficult to do a good comparison.
Thank you. I appreciate that clarification. And thanks for addressing the question as well. Also, one other quick question. How many chickens do fit in the hull of a ship?
All right, depends on the size of the broiler, and it depends on the size of the ship hull. But the interesting point of that is it's several hundred, actually thousands. And the reason that was important was because a lot of people don't realize that we send frozen chickens in the hull of a ship instead of in containers or in some nice packaging. They are put into the hull of a ship as breakable and often hauled to countries such as Romania. And we're a big exporter of chicken. We're a big exporter of pork, say, to China. So that's where strange numbers like that needed to be looked up.
Thank you, Alex. That is very interesting. Nice anecdote, and thanks for sharing. Well, let me see if there are, it looks like you're off the hook with questions from our panelists or from our participants. Thanks for your presentation. I'm going to go ahead and get ready to introduce our next speaker, and just stay tuned in case any questions come for you at the end of all the presentations. All right, so next we will be hearing from Amanda Connor, and Amanda serves as the Aviation Business Development Manager for North Carolina's Department of Transportation's Division of Aviation. In this role, she leads strategic planning and statewide efforts to expand North Carolina's aerospace sector. Amanda Connor partners with airports, government agencies, economic and workforce developers, higher education and industry to expand aerospace business recruitment, retention, and expansion, align regional and state assets and business plans, and strengthen the networks and infrastructure required to support aerospace companies. She brings to this work nearly 15 years of experience in economic development and STEM education. So Amanda, we're excited to have you here today. I'm going to pass it off to you and let you speak now.
Thank you. Much appreciated, Steve, and appreciate the ITRE team for involving me in the webinar series. Grateful to talk through the information that we currently work on in the Division of Aviation for our planning. Just a little bit about the Division of Aviation. Want to talk through the mission. Eugene, if you would advance the next slide, please, sir. Oh, yes, don't let me forget this. Sorry about that. I am an extrovert and I really enjoy interacting with the different people that, I serve as a public servant. And so part of my presentation today will include polls. And so just wanted to mention that when the poll comes up, Eugene will prompt that for us kindly. And if you would select your response to the question and submit it, have a little bit of discussion in regards to that. Don't worry if you don't know. Obviously, we are all here learning a lot today. And so excited to bring this information to you. Thank you, Eugene. With that being said, now the Aviation Mission. I have been blessed to work with aviation for almost 2 years now in the role of Aviation Business Development Manager, hand in hand with the various partners that Steve mentioned. Ultimately, as a team, our mission is to promote the economic well-being of North Carolina by developing a safe and robust air transportation system. Our team works hand in hand, and ultimately a lot of what my work directly involves is that robust air transportation system portion. And so in the next slide, you will see that that team has various core functions. And the greatest part of that load would be the Airport Development Grant Administration. We not only assist in extending the funds that are appropriated through our state legislator, but we are also a block grant state and administer the federal funds that come down from FAA. We have a unmanned aircraft systems program within the Division of Aviation, and that work goes towards the integration of this new technology into our existing airspace and into our existing climate. Within that safe integration of the unmanned aircraft systems, our program office works with other government entities, commercial and recreational users, and really make sure that it is integrated into what we are doing with regulatory environment. We also have education and professional development. A portion of this is not just for the safe and vibrant aviation system, but it's also for that talent pipeline of workforce needs that North Carolina has to support this industry. And that works hand in hand with a lot of what I do within the economic development realm. We also are housing the passenger services for state agencies. And within that, we also run various photogrammetry missions for the units in order to assist them. And so ultimately today, what I'll be covering is how we utilize the data applications in transportation planning specific to our economic contributions and that representation of our airports across the state. On the next slide, you will see that we have a very extensive network. We have 72 airports within this public use system. 62 of those are general aviation, which means that they are classified for regional or local use. We also have the commercial service, which is classified for regularly scheduled passenger service. These work hand in hand to serve the local businesses, communities, and the global markets. Also to house and refuel private aircraft. We also utilize them for military, agriculture, aviation, and statewide emergency response. And they provide aviation services such as aerial photography or pilot training. And so that's just to name a few of the services that all of these airports across the state offer. And just a fun fact, 94% of North Carolina's population lives within a 30-minute drive of a public airport. And so very accessible to the public here in North Carolina. And that brings me into the topics for today, given that background. A little over almost 2 years ago, I really came into the team looking at the data sets they were already utilizing, things that we could tweak a bit in order to pull information that could assist me in some of my work. One of the things that historically has been done since around 2006 is the North Carolina State of Aviation Report. This is done every 2 years, and so we'll talk a little bit about how that information is utilized, and then how the Division of Aviation has furthered that to also utilize it for additional purposes. We'll get into filed flight plan data. ITRE has been so instrumental in the partnership of helping us to access this information, putting it together so that it makes sense. It has visualization so that we're able to make connections, and then also extend that to our various partners and stakeholders for their understanding as well. And this filed flight plan data is an example of that, where we took public data from FAA, pulled it into a system for representation, and I'm happy to share that with you today. Also, there again, ITRE and their work to assist us with a hangar study for what we have existing across the state, looking at the different amenities that are available, the square footage, and then also what are the needs that we see, not just as a state, but as a nation for hangar developments and serving this industry. And last but not least, the North Carolina General Aviation Airport Economic Development Fund. This was initiated back in 2015 for time-sensitive airport projects and to help with that infrastructure in developing those and generating investment and the creation of jobs in North Carolina for our airports. And so happy to bring all of those to you. And on the next slide, we will go ahead and delve into the North Carolina State of Aviation. As I mentioned, this is led by the Division of Aviation in partnership with ITRE, conducting the research and findings. In looking at the recent study, which we released in January, based on 2019 data, it reveals significant economic impacts of North Carolina's public airports and the ecosystem that they support. In analyzing the 2019 data, it's going to provide this benchmark for tracking and recovery that we expect in 2021. And on the next slide, you will see that that economic contribution was $61 billion in economic impact, 373,000 jobs across the state, $15 billion in personal income from the jobs, and then of course the $2.5 billion in tax revenue that's generated from this various activity. In looking at that, because these are all really large numbers, this is 10% of North Carolina's gross domestic product, GDP. So very significant industry revenue generator for our state. And this report helps us to bring that to light through ITRE's hard work with their research. Looking at the next slide, the report goes a little further into, sorry, Eugene, can you go to the next slide, please, sir?
Sorry, do we want to bring up the tableau now? Okay. Let me.
Yes, that'd be great. Thank you, Eugene.
Let me bring that up for you. Give me just 1 second.
And so instead of going further into the report, ITRE has created a dashboard tableau for us to utilize. If you are within a community, you can simply select your airport. So for example, looking at Harnett County, HRJ, you can select that. It will show you the direct benefits, the economic output for each of those airports. For my work, a lot of what I do in partnership with Commerce and EDPNC or our regional economic development partners, they will ask us for specific regions or zones. And so you can actually utilize this tableau to select multiple airports, holding down the command key and selecting the different airports to show that combined economic output and also for the region. And so as Eugene is clicking on those and showing you how that functionality works, you will see that it refreshes and it gives you that information. So I'm not having to utilize an Excel spreadsheet to crunch numbers every time someone asks me for a different set of airports within their request. This has been very beneficial, not just to me, but also by extension, economic development partners and representation for what we are doing with prosperity zone work, with micro regions, and with those economic development regions and the partners.
And Amanda, sorry, my internet connection must be a bit slow right now, so I'm not getting the all the full interactivity. to demonstrate this right now.
No worries at all.
Eugene
Yes,
and
sir, and we're
Amanda,
happy to share this resource, this tool.
sorry to interrupt you, Amanda and Eugene. I was just gonna say, after the webinar, we plan on sending a link of the recorded webinar. I can also send a link of this dashboard so that our attendees can play with it. No trouble. We all recognize that we're here on a Zoom meeting and that the internet sometimes can be touchy.
Absolutely. I'm here in Eastern North Carolina, so definitely a product of that sometimes as well. And so there again, happy to share this with you. And so you can be able to pull up and click on the airports that are relevant to your work and your organization's missions by association with the airport support needed. Moving into the next slide, Eugene, from the presentation, wanted to initiate the first poll. Already shared with you North Carolina's system of 72 public airports, but not sure if you know that they transport business and leisure travelers each year in the millions. And so just given the four responses here, 62 million, 65 million, 70 million, 72 million, wanted to get your response on what you think that number actually was represented for 2019. 62 million, 65 million, 70 million, or 72 million. And like I said before, feel free to submit your responses.
Okay, I think everybody's had an opportunity to respond, Amanda. So I'm going to end the poll, share the results with folks.
Oh, very good, very good. So 33% of us, we were correct. 70 million business and leisure travelers are served by our North Carolina airports each year. The previous study, which was released in 2017, was actually the 62 million representation. So as you can see, just in 2 years, we have grown that by 8 million, very significant increase there. And we anticipate that this will continue to be a trend for us. COVID aside, and knowing that we'll need to rebound from some of that, very encouraged by the activity that our commercial services airports provide for those annual passengers and the destinations. And just knowing that the information pulled together, the 10th state for airline employment, we have 14 commercial airlines within our 10 commercial service airports. We have had almost 13% growth from 2015 to 2019 for airline jobs. And our commercial service airports connect us to 187 unique destinations, and that's cities and markets worldwide. So very proud of our airport system and what the commercial service airports are doing there. On the next slide, another sector within aviation are the various support industries. And one that I would love to highlight and connects to a few of you that are on the call today, air cargo. Air freight helps North Carolina meet the global demand for rapid movement of goods. And as you can see in the first bullet, we connect the freight system to rail, port, and trucking. And the airport's really a prime hub for these high-value goods, moving them quickly and efficiently. We are 16th among states in total tons of air freight moved each year, that being more than 1.1 million tons, and as you can see, worth $23 billion as of 2019. North Carolina ranks 8 in the U.S. for air freight services employment. We have 15 air cargo companies. Top carriers include Amazon, FedEx, UPS, and looking at the airports that are the highest ranking for that here in North Carolina, you have the Piedmont Triad International Airport coming in #1. We have Charlotte in #2, and then RDU very closely in #3. Utilizing the data that ITRE brings forward from this study, we are able to see how well we are representing this across our state, what pockets of the state are being utilized the most. And then we're connecting with our partners, like NCDOT Freight and Logistics for additional information. We're connecting with, Commerce and EDP&C for some of that importing, exporting, and really looking at how to build this information out further. Looking at what you see next with the $84 million in tax revenues from short-term leases and rentals of motor vehicles, that is a significant amount that is utilized to also support our airports. The 527 million gallons of fuel sold annually, just looking at that tax revenue and what that generates, which is a little over 7 million represented in 2019 in funding the General Aviation Airport Economic Development Fund. And so that in and of itself is significant in our planning for, the projects that are coming in and how we're able to look at them for funding potential. And then last but not least, that 11.6 million in revenues generated from based aircraft in our communities. This is very significant because that is a huge generator for local tax, and it's also assisting the industry in maintaining the fleets that are across our state for various purposes, whether it's corporate, recreational. And so looking at the support industries and those impacts gives us a broader picture of what's going on within our at our airports, and how it's not just the aviation industry sectors that they're serving, but how they're also serving, ag through corporate use, how they're also assisting maybe bio or pharma. And so building that out further, we anticipate having additional information on that in the next report for 2023. On the next slide, another poll. We know that maintenance, repair, and overhaul services are critical to fleets and ensuring that they are safe in the air and providing their service, regardless of what that aircraft is being used for. Data supports that the services increased employment in our state by a percentage from 2015 to 2019. And so just wanted to see your thoughts on what you believe that increased employment was. 46%, 47.3%, 53.6%, and 54.7%. And Eugene, thank you for prompting that poll. And so if everyone will take a moment to respond.
Okay, Amanda, looks like most folks had an opportunity to respond. I'm going to go ahead and end the poll and share the results.
Thank you, and thank you again for assisting in this. 50% of us are accurate. That growth was 54.7% from 2015 to 2019. And just to give you some food for thought, in the previous report where we were looking at that growth, same time span, but just 2012 to 2017, that was actually 46%. So as you can see, this industry is continuing to grow in North Carolina, and that's why it's also one of our focuses in economic development. On the next slide. ITRE has assisted us in being able to identify the locations of the various businesses and industry sectors within aerospace, aviation across the state. They even took that a step further, not just giving you the locations of the businesses, but showing you where we have higher densities of employment. And so as you may notice from the darker blue counties, that represents that higher density that I mentioned. And so, for example, just one to note, looking at Wayne, Lenoir, and Craven, this is an area that you have significant employment with FRC East and what they are doing with their MRO operations for governmental contracting. Also, Wayne County and U.S. Cargo and supporting the initiatives there and the airport growth that we have seen in recent years. And then, of course, within Lenoir County, Spirit Aerosystems and the North Carolina Global Trans Park, and their tremendous growth as industries are locating at that facility. We are able to take dashboards like this, see how the data is layered together, and really have significant findings that then lead us to even further discoveries. And so in looking at, let's say we go to Henderson County in the western part of our state and we say, did not realize that this was a high density area. You can then delve further into it to actually, make reference to which companies are there, looking at the services that they provide, their employment. And so ITRE has done a phenomenal job at compiling all of this in one location with multiple layers for us to then even reference back to as we move further along in, potential needs for the data. Thank you, Eugene. One of the ways that we are also tracking the activity across the state, not just by where existing industries are located, but are they expanding? Are they increasing employment? Are they increasing lines of services, production? And so we, working with ITRE, have identified the various announcements across the state and have plotted those. And so as you notice, you have a lot of activity in the Northeast. You have some in the Southeast. You also have significant activity around Durham, moving into Winston-Salem and Greensboro, a little further down into Charlotte. But you can actually see where, even during times of COVID, our state has seen significant increases or positive releases of them continuing to grow within our state. So I do encourage you, if you end up going through and you're reading various articles and you see where aviation aerospace companies are locating in North Carolina, they're growing. We would much rather see the information twice than once or not at all. So I encourage you, please feel free to, as you can see, send those announcements to Daniel Finley with ITRE at NC State, or I also will give you my contact information at the end. Feel free to share that with me. Very happy to continue to add to that data set as we move forward.
Amanda, just putting on my moderator hat quick, if you're by any chance able to try to summarize the remaining bits of your presentation in the next couple minutes, that would be helpful for our last panelist. Thank you.
Absolutely, Steve. I guess the sad thing is when you're super passionate about something, you can tend to go on and on and on forever. So definitely we'll pick up the pace on it. Thank you, Steve. One of the next frontier is the unmanned aircraft systems. We've talked about that a bit, but wanted to give you how have we utilized data in our planning. Looking at legislation, they are requiring that commercial pilots register within the North Carolina system in order to do business. We at the division utilize that information and see where they are located across the state, what services they are providing, ensuring that we are remaining forever first in flight in our work and the accomplishments of the integrated pilot program with FAA, moving into what we are now doing with Beyond. Looking at the first of where Beyond the visual line of sight has been awarded for bridge inspections, and where we demonstrated the first unmanned passenger taxi in the United States. Moving to the next slide, we also are closely watching aviation education impacts. Where are these programs located across our state? Who is offering them? Community college systems, 17 locations. University systems, 2 locations. Looking at the private institutions like Duke University and Embry-Riddle. And so ensuring that the workforce has accessibility to the training needed to further develop their skills or be ready for the next frontier of aviation skilled workers' needs. Moving into the next one, filed flight plan dashboard. This was generated based off of the filed flight plans from the FAA site in 2019. We will not go to the dashboard, Eugene, for sake of time. Looking at this dashboard, you can see collectively that all North Carolina flights over 1 million, arrivals, departures, break that down. You can also see on the right-hand side, the airport. You can go into each individual airport and see what their arrivals and departures represent, how many states or countries they touch, and last but not least, the scroll down on the left bottom panel, you can actually see the number of occurrences for those visits. Moving to the next slide. This one I will not skip because I think it's significant. So Eugene, if you'll pull up the Charlotte airport flights, this is representative of how you take a static data set, you give it animation and visuality, and then you're able to share this with stakeholders and others to really understand what's going on during a time period. And so during COVID, we know that commercial service was reduced significantly. In May of 2019, you can see the activity and it's just booming, all the international travel. And in May of 2020, you see it was significantly reduced, very little to no international travel, and the reduction of those flights from 2019 to 2020 for Charlotte, totaling up and seeing that that is represented over 13,000 flights less. And so this is significant in order to kind of tell the story of what's happening so that you can visually see that versus just looking at flat numbers in an Excel spreadsheet. So there again, kudos to the ITRE team for the development of this very useful tool. We have had tremendous response by our airports in its significance and how it can be utilized in their work locally and regionally, not just our state work. And so moving to the next. Looking at the hangar study, we have over 3,000 based aircraft in the state. And as I previously mentioned, that's 11.6 million generated state and local tax revenue. This is significant because they're a resource for local and regional communities. It generates that revenue through the real and personal property and job creation. It supports the various industry sectors across the state for the movement of people and goods in the global economy. This research helps us to understand where the existing hangar facilities are located, what their amenities, square footage, location, estimated lease rates, and also the potential for hangar developments that are needed based on confirmed wait lists, the compilation of proposed hangars that are outlined in airport layout plans. We can utilize the airport system plan goals to assist our airports in meeting their expected goals, so that with their hangar developments, what is that return on the investment? You know, how can we work with public and private funds to blend that for these developments? And then also we can look at forecasts of hangar development needs and where the areas of high priority reside within regions across the state. And on the next slide, you can see representation of this in the airport catchment area for based aircraft owners. As you get further away from that blue line above, it attracts from the outside area. And so this is where, you know, they may have more hangars, or there's a reason that even though the aircraft owner lives further away from that airport, they're wanting their plane, their aircraft to be at that airport. And then as you can see below the red line, potentially unmet demand of airports who potentially need additional hangars to service the aircraft owners. In the next slide, the Economic Development Fund, and we did mention how this was generated, but it's based upon 2015 legislation, North Carolina Competes Act. It directed state taxes of aviation gas and fuel to be dedicated to aviation capital improvement projects for economic development purposes. And as you can see, this is performance-based. And so we look at qualitative and quantitative assessments when reviewing the benefit analysis and the return on investment for the proposed project that's requesting funding. On the next slide, you'll see that we've also looked at aviation fuel tax revenues, so that it's not just an appropriation. It's not what we think. We can look at actuals, and we can track to see the growth in that or the decline. You can see where in 2021, there was that significant decline. But then you also see in 2019-20, which is representative of some of that COVID period, April, May, June, where it is significantly lower than what the state previously received in these revenues. We'll continue to track that as we move forward, and that helps us to plan, okay, so not just an appropriation, but actual, what do we anticipate being able to fund for these economic development projects as they come in and are submitted. And on the next slide, I've already talked about the aerospace sector and how that is spread, but really wanted to mention that being able to bring in these other qualitative airport characteristics or the significance to the airport and region, tools that were not even created for that purpose can be brought in to assist us in prioritizing the projects that are ultimately funded moving forward. And on the next slide, the corridors that are established based on existing transportation infrastructure is significant in also adding to the investments for building out those corridors. And on the next slide, being able to break things down by prosperity zone, as I mentioned, the economic contributions, so you can pull those up to see how that airport represents within its region. And on the next slide, if there are other economic contributing factors, tier designation. So does Commerce recognize it as a tier 1, tier 2 for prioritization of funding? Looking at the federal opportunity zone with the North Carolina designations and the airports that fall within those for maybe even alignment of other funding sources to help extend, what we're able to do with the state, bringing in additional private investment, federal investment, and other organizations that support these economic priorities at our airports. And on the next slide, Steve, hopefully I did a great job in wrapping that up pretty quickly, but this is just a few of the tools that we have been able to utilize thanks to ITRE and their amazing team in putting them together. Wish I could share all of them with you because it really makes my job easier.
Thank you so much, Amanda, for presenting. I really appreciate you sharing all the different data applications that you use, especially as they relate to economic development and aviation. I think the best way to move forward, if anybody has any questions for Amanda, go ahead and type them in the Q&A chat. And what we'll do, Amanda, is we'll just go ahead and hold those questions till the end of the presentation and give Thomas a chance to present. And for those of you who are in attendance today, we will make this presentation available. It's being recorded now, and I'll make sure to send a link. So if you have a hard stop at 3, no feelings hurt, feel free to drop off. But if for those of you that can stay on, we'll continue the presentation and answer questions after our next speaker.
Thank you. So, Thomas, yeah. Apologies.
No apologies
Not a problem.
Needed, Amanda.
You're fine.
Okay, so we're going to go ahead and pull up Thomas's presentation here. And Thomas Dudley is the program manager of the Operations Research and Education Laboratory, ORED, part of ITRE's School Planning and Transportation Group. For school districts across North Carolina, ORED leverages data and analysis to help guide long-term school facility planning decisions. For example, where to build new schools. By developing enrollment forecasts and other data-focused deliverables, ORED brings a quantitative perspective to often political and emotional conversations about school facilities and assignment plans. With a background in economics and GIS, that's Geographic Information Systems, Thomas also works across groups at ITRE, including the Economic and Policy Assessment Group, on diverse projects related to economic and spatial modeling. So with that being said, Thomas, I don't want to steal your thunder. Go ahead, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, sounds great. Thank you for the introduction, Steve. Definitely glad to be a part of this series. And so for the next few minutes, I'm going to be presenting the results from an NCDOT project. But more than just the results, I'm going to be focusing on the data that we used and some of the sort of creative application of the data sets that we used in a new way. That's really what makes this, this project unique. So we can go to the next slide here. Very good. So here's the context. Here's the purpose of the research. It was to identify bridges critical to North Carolina's ag and commerce freight network, which would not otherwise qualify for dedicated funding for improvement or replacement. So The deliverables are listed here, including obviously a map of these bridges that are critical that may be restricting commerce or ag activity. You can go to the next slide. And so there are two real metrics that we modeled in GIS to give us a good sense of how valuable these specific bridges are. First, traversal counts, and then detour time. So we have traversals first. That's just the model number of how many times a bridge is crossed by freight. The second metric, detour penalty. So what we did from a modeling perspective was if that one specific bridge were to be removed, what's the total penalty in terms of minutes traveled for businesses that otherwise would have been using that route? Let me see here. So starting on the left side and sort of working our way up from the bottom, we start with business locations from Business Analyst and ArcGIS, and we model the routes that businesses might travel in North Carolina. And from there, we're able to model those detours up the next level, the orange lines. And the parallel sort of analysis that goes from those two factors, those two metrics on the left, are the sort of traversal count, which that's just looking at each specific bridge and counting up how many traversals are on that road segment. And then the detour metric by bridge, just counting up those minutes that are accumulated once you sort of cut that bridge out of the system. So those are built up, and then we do a weighting scheme to weight depending on the trucking intensity, which I'll get into in a minute, to build the composite score, which is really just a combination of those two factors. So with that, we can go to the next slide and start with really what is the most basic data set that we have here. This is just weight restricted bridges from NCDOT. And that's about 10% of North Carolina's bridges, or about 3,000 bridges. Here we focus on weight restricted because those are going to be the ones that are hampering the movement of goods across the state or beyond. And we can go to the next one here, Steve. I'm going to talk through the analysis and the data, but I wanted to give a quick sneak peek of the results and where all this is going. So we had about 150 weight restricted bridges in our model that show a high level of trucking dependency. So these either were traversed a lot in the model, they have long detours if they were to be removed, or both. Perhaps, it may be surprising that so many of these are in the western third of North Carolina, half, third, in that ballpark. But it's important to note that that is where most of the bridges occur themselves, most of the weight restricted ones. And then that's also where, due to the mountains, if one road is out, detours are often very circuitous and may take an extra 45 minutes to get where you're trying to go if one bridge is out. So it's also important to note that this incorporates and models only the top 5,000 businesses that are labeled as being trucking dependent, or the most trucking dependent in North Carolina. And what does that mean? Well, we'll get to it on the next slide here. Go for it, Steve. Thank you. So we started with the business data set from ArcGIS and Business Analyst. So that's the location of where businesses are, what sector there are, how many jobs are there. And then we derived this trucking intensity metric for how dependent a business is on trucking or not. And you can see a couple examples over in the right side about a couple manufacturing companies or a couple of utilities. Really what this is it's a creative combination of the Business Analyst data set with some of the in-plan data as well. That it took some sort of reverse engineering, but we were able to get out of in-plan. Steve specifically was able to get out of in-plan some information about like what real portion of jobs in a given sector are trucking jobs. And so what we defined here as a trucking dependent business was one having a trucking intensity of at least 1, where you have the number of, where trucking intensity is just simply calculated as the number of jobs of that business times that sector, that business sector's trucking intensity. So with that, we can go on to the next slide. And this is just one example here, looking at Butterball. So overall, they have 2,400 jobs with an extremely high trucking intensity based on the sector trucking intensity of roughly 300 trucking jobs at this. And this puts it as one of the top, yes, it's the third highest trucking intensity business for all the businesses that we examined across the state. So that's a little bit on trucking intensity. To go to the next slide here, this next data set talking just about the road network, I'm not going to belabor it. A lot of us have worked with NCDOT's road network data set, but there are two modeling concerns that I just want to highlight quickly. The first is what is the bottom bullet point here on this slide, which is a connectivity issue. Connectivity policies are what's used to be able to get this straightened out. And the issue is what you see over to the right, where a business, the white dot, is trying to get onto the interstate and it just goes the shortest route. Issue is that connection is only an underpass. There actually isn't a ramp to get onto the interstate. We found it was essential for this project to make sure we handle that correctly, and it's pretty straightforward once you handle things correctly in ArcGIS using something called a connectivity policy. So that's what we did to be able to address that, and highly recommend taking the time to do that if you're using this data set for any other purpose as well. With that, we can go to the next slide. That sort of second consideration with the modeling of the road network is to look at route hierarchy. So we know that trucks, they don't get on a primary route and then hop off of it just to potentially save a few seconds on a route that might involve a bunch of right and left turns and, you know, a circuitous route or something like that. Once they're on a primary route, we assume that they like sticking to those to some extent, give some priority to that. And so you handle that with what's called a hierarchy. And so that's another important consideration if you're using this data set. With that, we can go to the next slide. So I've talked a good amount about traversals and detours, but in order to build up those routes on which traversals and detours are then built, you have to have origins and destinations. The origins, we handle them as being the businesses that are identified as being truck dependent. The destinations, that's where we had to get a little bit more creative. That's just one of the additional parts of this analysis. So what we introduced was border points, as we call them, which represent potential destinations that businesses might choose. So these borders, or these points across the borders of the state, and, you know, in Wilmington and other major ports and things like that, they represent sort of in each cardinal direction where major roads intersect with the boundary of the state. So what it shows here, if you're looking at, you know, say the one that goes east, the route from Raleigh and that business in Raleigh, the route that goes to the east with that yellow line going to Wilmington, I know it shows the entire route, but really there are no weight restricted bridges on I-40. You're not going to see that. What you're going to see, and where this analysis is going to focus, is on that first mile or two that it takes for that business to get onto a US route or to get onto an interstate. And that's exactly what we want. What that gives us and what that means is this is an approach that gives us a systematic way to account for travel in all directions. And it's focusing specifically around the businesses that are heavily trucking dependent. And perhaps most interestingly is that this isn't all that sensitive to how many border points you use. So, you know, whether it's, you know, 20 in the border to Virginia or half that many, we still see results that are consistent. Looking at the next slide here, you can see what these routes look like. These are used to calculate the traversals of each bridge. And then other analysis build up on top of that. That's just what the routes look like. On to the next slide. This gives a count of how many traversals there are. You can see things like the interstates jump out, obviously. And then there are other routes that are used, you know, significantly less frequently, but are also highlighted there. And on the next slide, you can see how this information is then just absorbed by the bridges that actually fall on those routes. But an important addition to that, instead of just counting how many times a bridge is crossed, we also do a weighting that's accomplished by that trucking intensity. So that butterball with the 300 trucking jobs, there is a way that weighting is incorporated into this metric, this traversal count that you see in front of you here. So that's one metric, one side, that's the traversals. And then if we go to the next slide, you can see the the detours, which again is if you remove one bridge at a time and you examine all of those traversals that would have occurred over that bridge, and you reroute all those businesses in some other way to get to those north, south, east, and west direction destination points. What is the true travel time impact to the network or to the businesses that we modeled? And so that's the sort of detour side. If we go to the next slide here, this is again the final results looking at the state and the 150 roughly bridges that are the most impactful in terms of ag and commerce, sort of as from a composite score perspective, looking at both the traversals and the detour time and weighting for trucking intensity, and also adding some additional weighting in for how far these bridges are away from the businesses that are trying to use them. With that, I'll just show one specific example, which is on the next slide. This is an interesting one. It's a paper manufacturing plant is right next to this bridge. The bridge is over a creek that runs north-south, just to the west of the supermarket there. And this is in downtown Silva. This was identified as our top sort of bridge that's most critical to ag and commerce that's weight restricted in the state. And this was part of a preliminary analysis, but I really wanted to show this one bridge because it's important to a lot of businesses, as you see over in the table to the right. But as we had this show up as our first result in one of our preliminary meetings, two of the members of the team actually knew exactly where this bridge was. Considering it's over 100 miles away, I thought that was quite interesting. I know this bridge because I know the pizza place that's across the street from the paper manufacturing plant. So that was kind of interesting. It was good to be able to ground truth that a little bit. It's like, yeah, it's a major paper manufacturer. In order to get onto I-74, you would probably want to go over that bridge, go east. So it makes a lot of sense. It was good to see results like that validated what we expected. With that, I'll go to my last slide here, if you would, Steve. And it's sort of glossing over it to say that we don't really have time for a sensitivity analysis component of this here. But as we examine different assumptions and as we try different border points and do all these things, there was a lot of consensus over what those top bridges were. We got the usual suspects, top 20 bridges, things like that, regardless of these different metrics we use, regardless of whether we're looking at that kind of composite score or one of the ones that help derive it. My last point to make here is definitely that a major disclaimer that this effort does require local knowledge and interviews of the businesses or extension offices of DOT minimally to be able to make sure that the results actually make sense. But what we do have now, as it was presented today, as it was presented to NCDOT, what we have now is an excellent defensible and quantitative starting point for NCDOT. So with that, I'll conclude and hand it back over to Steve. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. I appreciate the presentation. I'm just going to do one quick share here for the audience. Let's see. Now I think I'm the one with slow computer issues. I think that's okay. The purpose was to provide email contacts in case anybody in the audience had a question for either you, Amanda, or Alex. So thank you, Thomas, for taking the time to present. I'm going to take a quick look to see if there's any questions that came through in our Q&A. So I do have a question for you, Thomas. I think that you were able to conduct an extremely powerful analysis that narrowed thousands of bridges to a subset of the most critical bridges for North Carolina's commerce and agriculture. I guess kind of a broad question, but what are some of the key takeaways from this project? Is there anything that can be applied to transportation planning in general?
I mean, I guess for this audience, what I would suggest is, I mean, really one of the things that I learned too over the course of this is don't be afraid of there being many iterations of things. I mean, Steve, you and I saw this along the course of this project. I mean, we went through one thing after another in these different technical approaches and things, and it was great to be able to, you know, there was an art to it. To be able to see, you know, oh, well, this isn't working. Let's have a couple more check-ins and let's talk in the hallway and let's, you know, have everyone come together. And I think most importantly, what helped us through this project was having a diverse team with different backgrounds, you know, engineering, econ, planning, and others as well. So I think that was probably the major takeaway for me from it.
Great, thank you. I appreciate that, Thomas. And then, you know, since we have a little bit of extra time, I didn't get to ask Amanda a question related to her presentation. So Amanda is going to take the opportunity now and you know, based on a lot of the great data sources that can be used for economic development and planning, in your opinion, are there any that are most relevant for your daily work, or are there any data sources that are missing that you wish you had access to that would make life easier for you?
Well, I will say, Steve, that the greatest
I apologize, Amanda. I think I'm losing you with, think all across North Carolina, we're experiencing internet issues.
that are
Steve, I'm going to go ahead and mute Amanda. She's clearly we're having some buffering
Yeah.
issues.
economic developer would be, you know, the
Okay.
industry, not just something that was good. Thank you.
Sorry, Amanda, your the connection was audio was really buffering badly, so we didn't catch that. We'll have to let Steve follow up on that with you.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Well, it looks like you know, those are all the questions that we had today, and I really appreciate everybody who's in the audience taking the time to attend today. Really excellent panelist speakers, and I'll make as soon as our video recording is available, I'll make sure to circulate it with our panelists and our participants. So thank you, Thomas, thank you, Amanda, and thank you, Alex, for presenting here today. And you know, if anybody has any questions related to the presentations, just please feel free to reach out either to myself or directly to our panelists with the email provided. With that being said, Eugene, that's all I have for today. So, you know, that's it. We can close out the third of our trilogy for the data applications webinar series.